This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules, which together will comprise our first lecture on eliminative materialism. This lecture will serve the dual purpose of providing a general introduction to eliminative materialism, as well as discussing Paul Churchland's advocacy of the position in his 1981 paper, Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes. Our first step in the journey of this lecture will be to consider and dismiss several pernicious, prevalent, and oddly persistent conceptions of the view within the philosophical literature. The second step on our journey will be to remind ourselves of the descriptive semantics that eliminative materialists use to frame their view. We'll then discuss how eliminative materialists tend to construe our folk truisms as having the status of a theory. They are relatively systematic, they are used for prediction and explanation, and they are interpreted realistically according to the eliminative materialist. Hence, they give them the moniker of folk psychology. Given that folk psychology has these roles in our ordinary way of thinking and talking about the mind, we should think of these as theories and evaluate them in terms of their predictive and explanatory prowess, their potential for continued refinement and elaboration, as well as their consistency, both with other successful theories that we accept and as a candidate for realistic interpretation. It is at this point that the eliminativist offers up their argument for eliminative materialism, specifically that our folk truisms construed as a theory and evaluated using the sorts of criterion that I've just discussed prove woefully inadequate and hence should be eliminated in favor of the much more successful alternatives already available to us within the scientific community. Our final step in the journey of this lecture will be to look at the post-eliminativist world through the eyes of the eliminative materialist. We'll see that they have different conceptions of the role of folk psychology post-eliminativism, but that they all tend to agree on the alternative framework for theorizing about the mind within cognitive science moving forward. So let's take that first step on the journey of our lecture and start to look at the popular misconceptions that are associated with the position of eliminativism. To start, many people think that eliminativists deny the existence of mental states or of qualitative experiences just outright, but they don't. Eliminativists, like functionalists and type identity theorists, are engaged in that project that we described when we talked about the semantic twist. They want to understand how it is that physicalism can be true and how the truth of physicalism can be reconciled with our pre-theoretic understanding of the mind in our ordinary talk and our ordinary actions. This isn't to say that eliminative materialists don't in fact offer up a different and somewhat radical answer to that same theoretical problem. Eliminativists differ from functionalists or type identity theorists precisely because those theorists look at that relationship between our ordinary folk psychology and our scientific theories and try to find common ground and points of interaction. Consider, for instance, the logical behaviorists. They certainly were unafraid to declare certain parts of our folk psychology utterly meaningless. Nevertheless, they still held that many parts of our folk psychology, specifically the parts that related stimulus and response in terms of overt behavioral relationships, was in fact something that could be salvaged, saved, and incorporated into our scientific understanding. Or put another way, it was something that our scientific understanding validated. Eliminativists, on the other hand, look at these two theories, our folk psychology and the scientific theories that are responsible for predicting and explaining that phenomenon in the cognitive sciences, and they argue that our ordinary language, our folk psychology, gives us no meaningful insight into that phenomenon. That there aren't interesting points of reconciliation here because our folk theory is radically false. The eliminativist simply asserts that we should move past our ordinary mental terms, our folk psychology, in favor of the emerging understanding of the phenomenon given in the categorizations and theories of modern cognitive science, especially neuroscience, arguing that we ought to abandon our folk psychological or pre-theoretic conception of the mind in favor of our scientific conception of the mind may seem disconsonant with the project that we've been discussing so far. But the eliminativists see it as one of the many possible ways in which our pre-theoretic conceptions of the world can evolve as a result of systematic scientific investigation into the nature of those phenomena. And they do not see this as something that is unique to our understanding of the mind. They would point to our understanding of life, our understanding of combustion, our understanding of chemical reactions, and countless other examples from the history of human thought. As a result, eliminativists feel it's ridiculous to reject their theory as somehow radical or fundamentally different in its approach than other theories in the contemporary philosophy of mind. In fact, they would hold that, like ordinary mental terms themselves, these criticisms are so much sound and fury signifying nothing, and countless other examples from the history of human thought. As a result, eliminativists feel it's ridiculous to reject their theory as somehow radical or fundamentally different in its approach than other theories in the contemporary philosophy of mind. In fact, they would hold that, like ordinary mental terms themselves, these criticisms are so much sound and fury signifying nothing. Having defended eliminative materialists against a number of misconceptions, it's also important not to propagate another misconception, namely that all eliminativists conceive of folk psychology in exactly the same way and offer up exactly the same argument. Eliminative materialists, like any other collection of theorists, have variations in how they understand and argue for their view. Proponents like the churchlands construe mental terms as a substantive psychological theory, the goal of which is to create a theoretical framework for prediction and explanation. Other theorists, like Dan Dennett, think of mental terms along the lines of a conceptual scheme rather than a theory. They're a set of categorizations that are used in theorizing about the nature of the mind, but they aren't inherently constrained purely to that single goal.